mother of 3 was found shot 14 times in her own bathroom. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. And weeks before her death, she wrote, "If something happens to me, investigate Tim first." The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the early morning wind. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no splintered wood. Just a silence too thick for a house that once echoed with children's laughter. Inside, the air was still, unnaturally cold. In the bathroom, Rebecca Bliefnick lay crumpled on the tile floor, lifeless. Her body had already begun to stiffen. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the grout lines, seeping outward in dark, uneven rivers. The white of the porcelain sink beside her was flecked with red. 14 spent shell casings surrounded her like a grotesque halo. The crime scene told a story even before the autopsy began. Multiple shots, some fired while she was standing, others while she was already on the ground. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. The victim likely had little or no warning before the first shot was fired. That alone speaks volumes about the intent of the killer. This was not a panicked act. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed with chilling precision. The use of a homemade silencer, a thick plastic bag later found torn and partially melted, suggests the perpetrator had both the time and the knowledge to suppress the sound of gunfire. The residue of the bag scattered in fragments, some of which landed inside the open wound channels, confirming it had been wrapped around the barrel at the time of the shooting. This was not the method of an impulsive attacker. It was a method chosen by someone who needed the house to remain silent while death took place inside it. When Rebecca's father entered the house hours later, he found his daughter exactly as the killer had left her. He called emergency services from a neighbor's phone. His own device had slipped from his grasp. Officers arrived shortly after, and within minutes, the area was cordoned off. But by then, the killer was long gone. Investigators would later determine the approximate time of death to be shortly after 1 a.m. That conclusion was drawn not just from lividity and body temperature, but from digital timestamps and security footage from nearby homes. A figure had been captured riding a bicycle through the neighborhood. Dressed in a long coat with a hood pulled low, the rider passed several cameras in the span of 20 minutes. One of those cameras, mounted on a neighboring home, showed the same figure approaching Rebecca's front steps just before 1:11 a.m. The exact time her smart security system logged that the front door had opened. The figure returned by 1:16 a.m., pedaling away in the same direction, the same slow, methodical pace. The footage revealed no signs of panic or urgency, only determination. That 5-minute window between entry and exit would prove critical. It was enough time for a murder to be carried out, for a life to be ended with ruthless finality. The sheer violence of the act, 14 gunshots all fired at close range, implied not just intent, but an underlying emotional investment. This was not a robbery. Nothing had been taken. No valuables were disturbed. It was not a random break-in, and there was no attempt to stage the scene. The motive was personal, and the killer had likely known the victim intimately. The killer's behavior followed the profile of a highly organized offender. He brought his own weapon. He brought his own transport, a bicycle, chosen deliberately for its silence and ability to avoid license plate recognition. He disabled digital traces by turning off his phone and wearable devices. He selected a time when the children were not at home. He ensured that no witnesses would be present. In criminal psychology, this level of preparation, paired with close contact overkill, often points to a suspect driven by a perceived betrayal or a loss of control. The killer was not reacting in the heat of passion. He was reclaiming what he believed he had lost by force. At the center of the crime scene, however, was not the story of a killer, but of a woman who had once feared this very outcome. Rebecca had written to family and friends in the past, expressing concern for her safety. She had spoken of feeling watched, of being silenced, of the uneasy sense that someone close to her might one day act on darker impulses. On this morning, that fear became real. The house, once a place of family dinners and bedtime stories, had turned into a tomb. No screams were heard, no alarm was raised. Only the door, gently swinging open in the wind, marked that something had gone terribly wrong. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Months before Rebecca Bliefnick's body was discovered on the bathroom floor, before the blood pooled and the silence settled in, her life appeared almost enviable from the outside. A picturesque house in Quincy, Illinois, a devoted mother of 3 boys, a respected nurse who had traveled across the country during the COVID-19 crisis, risking her own health to help strangers survive. Her smile, often caught in family photographs and social media posts, gave no hint of the growing dread that stalked her in private. Timothy Bliefnick, her husband of over a decade, had been a figure of admiration in the local community. A former college football standout, later inducted into Quincy University's Hall of Fame. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was disciplined, charismatic, and dependable. A man who had once appeared with his family on national television, cracking jokes on an episode of Family Feud. In that studio lighting, he was the embodiment of a wholesome Midwestern father. But the reality inside the Bliefnick home was slowly unraveling. By early 2021, the couple's marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. Arguments had escalated from disagreements over parenting to dark, quiet threats that never made it outside the walls. There were no police reports, no screaming matches that neighbors overheard, just silence and the subtle, terrifying erosion of safety. Rebecca had begun confiding in those close to her. Messages later recovered from her phone painted a clear picture of her fear. She believed Tim was watching her, tracking her movements. She suspected he was hiding assets as the divorce dragged on. She warned that he might do something irrational, especially if he felt he was losing control. Those fears were not paranoia. In domestic violence cases involving coercive control, victims are often dismissed when there are no bruises to show. But in criminal psychology, coercive control is one of the most dangerous forms of abuse, where the abuser's goal is to dominate, to monitor, to isolate, and to punish any act of independence. Rebecca knew her estranged husband owned firearms. She had asked for the return of a handgun that legally belonged to her, a 9mm pistol she no longer felt safe knowing was still in his possession. But the weapon remained with him. Her divorce attorney, concerned for her safety, had raised the issue in court filings. Still, nothing immediate was done. Like many women in her position, Rebecca continued to move forward cautiously, hoping the legal system would offer protection, while knowing deep down it rarely moved fast enough. The Bliefnick custody battle intensified. Tim filed motions. Rebecca filed responses. The court assigned a guardian to oversee the children's welfare. At one point, an order was put in place requiring both parents to stay within 3 feet of their cars when exchanging the children. An unusually precise measure, clearly designed to reduce opportunities for confrontation. It was a small shield, paper thin, and it did little to protect against what was coming. Over time, Rebecca's emotional exhaustion began to show. Friends described her as drained, preoccupied, and anxious. But she kept working, kept showing up for her sons, kept believing that if she followed the rules of the courts, of decency, of reason, she would eventually come through the other side. What she didn't know was that her fear, once a distant unease, was already taking physical form, quietly, deliberately. Her warnings, her text messages, her unease, all of it pointed to a man who was losing control, not just over a marriage, but over the image he had so carefully crafted. For individuals with rigid, identity-bound concepts of masculinity and dominance, the end of a relationship is not just personal loss. It is perceived humiliation. Rejection becomes betrayal. And betrayal to the wrong mind demands correction. By the fall of 2022, Tim had started to withdraw even further. He rarely communicated beyond what was necessary for child custody. He became secretive, careful, withdrawn. But behind that quiet, the machinery of resentment had already been set in motion. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained vigilant. She tried to minimize contact, limit exposure, document everything. But documentation cannot stop a bullet. She continued to live and work as though the worst could be avoided, even as it crept closer with each passing day. The image of a perfect family had long since collapsed. What remained was a woman moving through life with invisible weights around her ankles, and a man who believed he was entitled to bring everything crashing down the moment she tried to walk away. In early January of 2023, subtle movements began to form a quiet pattern, one that wouldn't be visible until it was too late. Timothy Bliefnick, now months into a contentious divorce and barely speaking to his estranged wife, began taking small, deliberate steps. Not loud, not impulsive, just careful, controlled. The kind of steps that individually seemed harmless, but when pieced together, revealed the outline of something cold and irreversible. He created a new Facebook account under a fake name, John Smith. Through this anonymous profile, he began contacting sellers on Marketplace, asking about used bicycles. Not cars, not motorcycles, just quiet, ordinary bikes. A blue Schwinn, a black mongoose. He asked specific questions: frame size, tire condition, whether the bike made any noise when pedaled. These were not casual inquiries. They were about function, about silence. Around the same time, he reached out to a neighbor. Casually, he asked if there were any security cameras pointing toward his backyard. The question, on its surface, seemed benign, but it wasn't small talk. He was mapping blind spots, studying vulnerabilities, identifying the gaps that police would later scramble to close. By mid-February, the movements became sharper. On February 10th, Timothy called the Quincy Police Department and asked them to return a firearm on his behalf, a 9mm pistol that once belonged to Rebecca. He claimed he didn't want to deliver it directly. The police declined. But the request itself raises a chilling question. Why return a gun he still intended to use? It's common for offenders with calculated intent to rehearse portions of their plan, to gauge reactions, to test what they can get away with before the real act is carried out. This behavior fits that mold. It gave him an alibi of effort, a record that on paper made him appear cooperative, reasonable even, while hiding a much darker intent. Digital footprints, later retrieved by investigators, showed an unsettling shift in Timothy's online activity. His search history included queries about how to wash off gunpowder residue, how to break into a house with a crowbar, and how long it takes police to respond to a 911 call. these searches weren't clustered together. They were spread out over days, masked between innocuous queries and everyday browsing. But to someone trained in criminal behavior, the pattern was unmistakable. He wasn't just researching, he was rehearsing. There were also searches related to Ted Johnson, Rebecca's new partner. Timothy looked up vehicle registration databases, license plate lookups, even VIN information. The impulse was familiar: surveillance. In his eyes, the loss of his marriage was not the end of a relationship. It was a theft of something he believed still belonged to him. In domestic homicide cases, there is often a tipping point, a moment where resentment moves from theory to action, where the imagined loss of control hardens into violent resolve. For Timothy Bliefnick, that moment appeared to crystallize not in anger, but in preparation. His movements were quiet, but they were moving toward a fixed destination. Around this time, a witness would later recall Rebecca appearing distracted, almost haunted, her eyes distant, her words cautious. She mentioned strange behavior, odd questions, and a growing sense that something was coming. But she kept going. She had her children, her work, her routines. And when the people around her saw her smile, they believed she was strong enough to endure whatever she was facing. But predators often rely on that illusion. The illusion that their victim will keep moving forward unaware until it's too late to turn back. What Rebecca didn't know was that she was being watched, not just in real time, but digitally, strategically. Her schedule, her habits, her home, all of it was being traced by someone who had once loved her, or claimed to. And so the final days before her murder passed not in panic or chaos, but in eerie quiet. No confrontation, no warning. Only shadows moving in the periphery. A man, masked by familiarity, blending into the background of a life he could no longer control, preparing not to strike in anger, but to erase her completely, as if she were never meant to leave him in the first place. On the evening of February 22nd, 2023, Rebecca Bliefnick settled into her home on Kentucky Road. The children were not there. She had asked Timothy to take them for a few days, a simple request, like many before it, meant to give her space to rest. She had spent the evening with her partner, Ted Johnson, sharing brief moments of quiet normalcy, unaware that it would be the last time she would know peace. Just after midnight, as most of the neighborhood lay asleep, a lone figure moved through the empty streets. Surveillance footage from several homes captured a cyclist, head covered, face hidden, pedaling slowly, purposefully. He circled the blocks near Rebecca's house, never stopping, never rushing. At 1:10 a.m., he disappeared into the shadows that bordered her yard. A minute later, her smart security system registered that the front door had been opened. The door bore no signs of forced entry in the traditional sense, but later examination revealed pry marks near the lock, subtle, deep enough to bypass the frame without splintering the wood. The intruder knew what he was doing. He had come prepared. Inside, Rebecca likely heard the intrusion. Her phone was found on the floor near the hallway, screen lit, frozen on an attempted 911 call that never connected. Investigators believe she tried to reach for help, but the call failed before it could transmit. There were no screams reported, no sounds of a struggle loud enough to alert neighbors, only silence. By 1:16 a.m., the same cyclist was seen on camera again, now leaving the area. He moved at the same steady pace, turning corners, disappearing down a side street. He did not look back. Inside the house, in the narrow space between the bathroom and the hallway, Rebecca's body lay collapsed. 14 gunshots. The pattern suggested she was shot multiple times while still standing, then again after she had fallen. The last wounds, fired downward into her body, spoke not only of rage but of certainty. The killer had not come to threaten or to warn. He had come to finish something. Blood had soaked into the tiles and baseboards. Shell casings were scattered near the doorway, under her limbs, embedded in dried pools of red. The impact markings on the walls indicated that the shots were rapid, tightly grouped. No bullet holes were found in other rooms. Every round had been aimed at her. The house gave no signs of robbery. No drawers opened, no valuables touched. The scene remained undisturbed beyond the area of the killing. There was no sign of a getaway vehicle. No shoe prints. Only the ghost of motion captured on grainy night vision cameras, and a quiet that no one had noticed until it was too late. Around 6:45 a.m., a neighbor left for work and noticed that Rebecca's front door was ajar. He paused, but assumed she had simply forgotten to shut it. The stillness gave nothing away. Hours passed. No one called. No one checked. It wasn't until 3:30 p.m. that her father, Bill Posel, arrived at the house. She hadn't answered messages. The children were supposed to return home soon. Something felt wrong. He knocked. No answer. He stepped inside, calling her name. The silence inside the house greeted him like a wall. When he reached the bathroom, he stopped. Nothing in his life had prepared him for what he saw. His daughter, the child he had once carried in his arms, now lifeless, bloodied, and cold. Her arm stiff when he tried to lift it. The life in her gone for hours. He staggered outside to ask a neighbor for a phone. His hands were shaking. His voice barely formed the words. At 4 p.m., officers arrived at the home. The investigation began at once, but the weight of what had happened, of how deliberately it had been done, hung heavy over the scene. The quiet neighborhood of Quincy had never seen a murder like this. Not with such method, not with such intimacy. The killer had chosen the hour carefully. He had waited until the house was empty, until the children were away, until the dark masked his arrival and silence cloaked his retreat. This was not a random act. It was a final statement. A man had come to a place that had once been his home, not to reconcile, but to destroy what he no longer controlled. The investigation into Rebecca Bliefnick's murder began with a house that held no strangers. The scene was intimate, familiar. There were no broken windows, no signs of ransacking, no foreign DNA smeared across doorknobs or railings. Whoever had entered her home had known the layout, had known where she slept, had known that she would be alone. By the afternoon of February 23rd, the Quincy Police Department had already begun collecting video footage from surrounding homes. What emerged almost immediately was a pattern, an unknown cyclist moving repeatedly through the neighborhood, captured on camera between 12:30 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. His path was precise. He didn't linger. He rode with intent. When the timestamps were aligned with Rebecca's front door opening at 1:11 a.m. and the last sighting of the cyclist at 1:16 a.m., the window of violence came into chilling focus. In the following days, more pieces began falling into place. On February 27th, an abandoned blue Schwinn bicycle was discovered near the Quincy Public Schools bus garage, just over a mile from the crime scene. The bike matched the one seen in surveillance videos. It had been wiped down, but not perfectly. A few fingerprints remained, partial but traceable. The frame bore scuffs consistent with a recent purchase from a private seller, one of several Timothy Bliefnick had inquired about weeks earlier, using a fake online identity. Search warrants were obtained. Timothy's home, his vehicle, and his digital devices were all seized and examined. In his basement, officers discovered several spent shell casings. Forensic analysis confirmed they matched the 9mm rounds found near Rebecca's body. The ballistic striations, microscopic grooves left by a weapon's barrel, were identical. But that was only the beginning. Inside a utility drawer, officers recovered a torn plastic bag, the kind used to wrap clothing or linens, but this one bore faint traces of soot, melted edges, and, most damning, a small speck of dried blood. Lab results confirmed the blood belonged to Rebecca, and within the fibers of the plastic, tiny granules of gunpowder were found, the same kind used in the cartridge cases scattered across her bathroom floor. The prosecution would later argue that the bag had been used as a crude suppressor, wrapped around the muzzle of the gun to muffle the sound of the shots. It wasn't perfect, but in a quiet neighborhood, it had been enough. No one had heard the gunfire. No one had called the police. The digital evidence left an even deeper trail. On the night of February 22nd, both Timothy's phone and his wearable fitness tracker went dark between 12:30 and 2:07 a.m. No data, no steps recorded, no heart rate, no GPS ping. A perfect blackout during the exact time the murder occurred. When the device came back online, it resumed normal activity as if nothing had happened. Even more damning were the internet searches. In the weeks prior to the murder, Timothy had looked up how to clean off gunshot residue, how to open a door with a crowbar, how long it takes police to respond to emergency calls. He researched Rebecca's boyfriend's license plate, searched for vehicle tracking tools, asked, through anonymous forums, whether gunshot residue could be traced days after use. Nothing in his history indicated curiosity. Everything pointed to intent. This level of preparation fit the profile of a highly organized killer. There was no loss of control, no outburst, no panic. Each decision, from the weapon to the mode of transportation to the time of the attack, had been weighed, tested, and executed with discipline. He didn't leave a note. He didn't make a call. He didn't speak to anyone before or after. He left only silence and the weight of a plan fulfilled. On March 13th, 2023, Timothy Bliefnick was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The trial that followed would not be about motive. It would be about proof. And the proof, when laid out before the court, would tell a story far more convincing than any words he could offer in his defense.